Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at a very interesting iPhone that Apple made many years ago, and this was actually the iPhone 4S. So this was pretty much the direct successor to the iPhone 4, and I do think the iPhone 4 was a pretty impactful phone. I mean, that was probably the most impactful phone of all time, but funny enough, I feel like the iPhone 4S is almost what the iPhone 4 should have been. I feel like you could say that with every single phone out there, but because the iPhone 4 to the 4S was such a small upgrade, but because the 4S brought some pretty interesting features, it may have made a little bit more sense for Apple just to go ahead and have brought these features over to the iPhone 4. Like, I'm not too sure where exactly they would fall in line with that, but basically the main thing is this is a very old phone now. It's 12 years old going on this year, and with this phone coming out in 2011, I mean, it's a pretty old phone when it comes down to it. Now, definitely what I will tell you is this phone is not necessarily worth buying and using as your main device, but if you are in the market and if you did want to buy a phone, I will also leave some links in the description. If you want to pick up some phones, you can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of this phone, this device looked beautiful. Back then in 2011, 2010, when these iPhones actually came out, this and the iPhone 4, there weren't too many iPhones that looked as beautiful as this thing did. This was easily one of the most beautiful looking iPhones of all time. And that was one of the most shocking things. And whenever I like this specific device, or when I look at this device, it is shocking to me how beautiful this iPhone looks. I mean, it's a beautiful device. I like it so much. And at that moment, there weren't many other iPhones or phones in general that were built and look like this. Now, this phone on the front, that 3.5-inch display, it was a Retina display, so that's kind of what the new thing Apple was kind of stating during, around this time. And again, I think it was a pretty good display. Nowadays, I mean, it's a, not that great of a panel. I mean, it's definitely small, has pretty thick bezels around it. But I do think at this moment, it was a really good display. And I still remember during that time, one of the biggest problems of iPhones, or reason why people wouldn't buy an iPhone, is because of the size. It was a smaller phone even back then. It's a really small phone now, but it was just built so well. That's one of the big things to keep in mind. Now, we do have the home button on the front, no Touch ID or anything like that. On the bottom, we have the standard charging port. And this was actually the last iPhone before we got the Lightning port. So this was the last iPhone to have that 30-pin connector. So I guess this is one of the last in that specific standpoint as well. And on the back, we had a glass back. Beautiful glass back as well. I mean, again, this phone was pretty much a replicate of the iPhone 4. So there really wasn't too many crazy things being brought into here. But I think that in and of itself was a pretty cool thing. Now, with the camera on the back, the camera on the front, I really like that type of stuff. But this iPhone also brought a lot of firsts. I was going to talk about this in the software department, but I kind of want to just hit on it now. I mean, this iPhone brought Siri. That's kind of what the S kind of stood for, I guess, in this specific example. But that was like that, Siri that we have nowadays. It's like a voice assistant. It's cool. It's great. It could be better. But this iPhone kind of debuted with it, which is cool. But it also came with iOS 5. So this is the craziest thing. This iPhone was the first iPhone. iOS 5 came on other devices too. But this iPhone introduced iCloud. Okay, just think about that in and of itself. Think about where iCloud is nowadays. This iPhone debuted with it, which is crazy. This iPhone also brought iMessage with iOS 5. That's another massive influential thing as well. It also brought in the notification center, which was very interesting. It brought in reminders, and we got Twitter integration with this. So that in and of itself, from this Wikipedia article, just stating those things in and of itself is crazy. And I will say the iPhone 4 was more impactful in terms of hardware. The iPhone 4S was probably more impactful in terms of software when it comes down to it. And we'll talk about the software in a second. But that kind of stuff is really crazy when it comes down to it. So from the outside and from some of the things that came with this iPhone, it's a pretty impactful device if you already don't agree with that. Now, in the camera department, like I mentioned, this thing on the back actually had an 8-megapixel camera, which was actually pretty decent. I think nowadays, again, it's not that great, but it brought, video calling on the front, as always. I don't know if I think FaceTime was around during this time, with that back camera as well. That's a pretty cool thing. It was pretty solid. And to kind of think about it, from the iPhone 4S to the iPhone 5 to the 5S to the 6 and 6 Plus, every iPhone since then was 8 megapixels. Now, of course, they were better. They weren't the same, megapixel. I mean, they weren't like the same feature set, but you did have the same megapixel count, which was very, very interesting. So this type of camera nowadays is definitely outdated. I don't think anybody would want to use this camera anymore. It is very choppy and grainy. The biggest thing kind of with this specific camera though probably nowadays is the fact that it's not only an old camera with very few features, but the hardware, I mean, it's not that great. You are missing things like an ultra-wide and telephoto lens that we have like even on the most basic budget phones. But at that time in 2011, this was probably one of the best cameras of that time for a mobile, phone, which is insane to think about. So from that perspective, I don't want to hate on the camera too much, but you do have to keep in mind it's an older device, but that's honestly some pretty, insane stuff when it comes down to it. Now, on top of that, in that software department, we already kind of talked about some of the cool things that this phone ended up bringing, all the iCloud, iMessage, so many things like that. This phone, although did, even though it debuted with iOS 5, it did end with iOS 9, which was very interesting. It was kind of notorious that iOS 9 was probably the biggest flop for the iPhone 4S. From what I've heard, it sounded like the iPhone 4S should not have gotten iOS 9, but every time I boot up iOS 9 on my 4S, it's not that bad. But again, I wasn't using this phone every day during that time period when iOS 9 was the main version of software. So I totally understand where people are coming from, and I will tell you that's kind of what happens. That's kind of the main caveat of getting a phone that is still supported with software. When it's an old phone that's still getting the latest version, that can be a big downside for some people. And in this case, it's pretty much no different. So in this specific example, you're kind of stuck in a situation where this iPhone, I mean, it's not necessarily worth it anymore per se, but the software department, it's very, very outdated when it comes down to it as well. So in that perspective, it's a little different in my opinion. Now on the performance side, this iPhone did bring that Apple A5 chip inside of it with 512 megabytes of RAM. So that is still pretty crazy. That is still a very low amount of RAM to have on a device like this. And again, when it comes down to the performance, you're really not going to be getting that great of a performing phone from this thing anymore. But at that moment, you have to think about it. This was pretty much the fastest iPhone of all time during that moment. And that kind of stuff is so crazy to me. You would never think that that type of device would pretty much just like never ever get into a situation where it would be the fastest phone. But it is. And that's kind of the situation we're in now. So when it comes down to it, this iPhone, it can't really do too much anymore. Like you can't really download any apps on it. You can't really, there's just not really too much you can do with it. But what I do think is that in this specific situation, it was a good phone then. It's not really worth buying now, but I think a majority of people know about it. So, but just keep in the back of your head, this was the fastest phone of all time at that moment. So this is pretty wild. Now, in the battery life department, this iPhone, I think, had an okay battery life, 1,432 milliamp hour battery. So basically everything I've ever done with this phone, it's been pretty, it hasn't been the most solid performing phone of all time, but you do have to give it respect. There was a time where this was the fastest phone, so you kind of have to give it some respect there. So when it comes down to it, I definitely do think that the, iPhone 4S is probably not the phone you want to use on an everyday, basis right now, but it was a very, very impactful iPhone, more so in the software. And that's why I always kind of think the iPhone 4 is kind of what the 4S should have been in a way. I feel like the iPhone 4S kind of brought the software aspect where the iPhone 4 brought the, hardware aspect. So although this phone isn't worth buying anymore, if you're going to go ahead and get it as some sort of collector's item, then by all means go for it. But beyond that, it's probably not worth buying anymore. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.